As I was nervously preparing to watch the debate, you kept reminding me vice presidential debates usually don't matter that much. After watching last night, do you still feel that way?
I do. Vice presidential debates don't matter. If they did, then Michael Dukakis would have been elected in 1988. In this debate, though, there are several interesting things occurred, even though vice presidential debates don't matter. Polls show that Midwestern nice actually worked despite Walz's shaky start, despite his stumbles on the China answer, which I have no idea why he didn't have an answer ready for that, other than saying I'm a knucklehead. I'll remember that. And just generally, you had with J.D. Vance, you had the elitist, the guy that went to an Ivy League school, who smoothly knew how to answer all the questions, smoothly knew how to work the format. And I think most people would say he did much better last night stylistically. But interestingly enough, and I've always found this with debates, you never know how something's going to come across. And Mika, when I saw the CNN poll last night that came out, it shows that Midwest nice really worked for Walz. Tim Walz's favorability jumped up 13 points. He has a 59% favorability rating after the debate, a 22% unfavorable rating before the debate. This is, I don't care if you're on Fox News, if you're AON, if you're on Newsmax, you just have to look at these numbers and you have to say that's extraordinary in modern American politics. For all of us watching, for all the elites watching that say, oh, he looked too nervous at the beginning. Oh, he was there's something that viewers liked, that undecided voters liked, that registered voters liked about Tim Walz. Maybe that's something that we'll be sorting through over the next few weeks to figure it out, even though it won't have a big impact on the election anyway. And J.D. Vance, his number, yes, he's upside down, 41% favorable, 44% unfavorable. But he also showed a side of himself that he has not shown before. And that is he tried to be more likable. He tried to be more agreeable. The people that knew him before he decided to be a Trumper said that he was a nice guy. He was a charming guy. And he tried to show a lot more of that last night because it's almost as if he got a sense that this election may end and he doesn't want to completely tie himself to Donald Trump. He's 40 years old. He has a future. And while Trump likes going to war nonstop, against everybody, you got a sense that J.D. Vance decided, hey, you know what? I'm gonna try to salvage my political career, even if Donald Trump goes up in flames. And so that would have all been fine and dandy. And there's no doubt this morning there's going to be consternation in Mar-a-Lago because everybody's saying that J.D. Vance should talk for the rest of the campaign and Donald Trump should shut up because J.D. Vance is so much better at this than Donald Trump. It's not even a close call. I mean, Donald Trump.
Lying?
Donald Trump is he's just smoother. If you want to say smooth liar, you can. But Donald Trump, though, I mean, he's getting old. He's they're not even letting him do 60 minutes because they know he's just not capable of doing it because he can't answer policy questions. But still, J.D. Vance was stylistically better. He told a lot of lies about ACA. He told a lot of lies about other issues. But I will say this, J.D. Vance was very clarifying at the end of this debate. And he told viewers everywhere that was watching, if you hate American democracy, when things don't go your way, vote for me. If you hate everything that James Madison put together and Alexander Hamilton put together in the Constitution, if you hate the tradition of peaceful transitions that really, really define and ensure American democracy, if you hate that, if Donald Trump doesn't win every election, vote for me. It was one of the most clarifying moments in any presidential or vice presidential debate we could ever see because he clearly said that he was going to continue the lies of Donald Trump and not even answer the basic question, did Joe Biden win the 2020 election? And yes, that will work very well for a lot of hard right people on the internet and maybe on X and other social media platforms. But he defined himself. He defined his campaign, and he defined the choice in this election. I am not a Democrat. I doubt I will ever be a Democrat. I'm an independent. And I'm one of those people that's looking at both of these guys, and people ask me why don't you support the Republicans? JD did my work for me last night, because one side is anti-democratic, the other side is pro-democracy, pro-constitutional republic, pro-James Madison checks and balances, pro-peaceful transfer of power,
pro-women's rights,
and well, you can debate that.
I get
that's been
yes,
part of that's been part of the debate since 1973. What has not been part of the debate has been whether we continue with a constitutional republic where there are peaceful transitions of power. And last night, J.D. Vance refused to answer whether he supported the peaceful transfer of power, Willie. And as Robert Frost would say, it's either Robert Frost or Horseshack, and that made all the difference.
Yeah, I mean, after a strong debate performance that had, I agree with you, what you're hearing,
he was good.
When they had Republicans saying either J.D. Vance is the future of the Republican Party, or I wish he were at the top of the ticket because he is so much better at this than Donald Trump. The mask slipped there at the end when he was asked a very simple question from Tim Walz, who turned to him and said, did Donald Trump lose the 2020 election? He did not answer that question. And by the way, leading up to that, he said again and again, we had a peaceful transfer of power. Okay, maybe in that 1 hour on that one day in January 20th, it was peaceful, as, by the way, the Capitol was ringed with security fence so nothing could happen because of what did happen on January 6th, trying to rewrite history. Here was the exchange at the end that Joe's talking about.
Would you again seek to challenge this year's election results, even if every governor certifies the results? I'll give you 2 minutes.
Well, Nora, first of all, I think that we're focused on the future. We need to figure out how to solve the inflation crisis caused by Kamala Harris's policies, make housing affordable, make groceries affordable, and that's what we're focused on. But I want to answer your question because you did ask it. Look, what President Trump has said is that there were problems in 2020, and my own belief is that we should fight about those issues, debate those issues peacefully in the public square, and that's all I've said, and that's all that Donald Trump has said. It's really rich for Democratic leaders to say that Donald Trump is a unique threat to democracy when he peacefully gave over power on January the 20th, as we have done for 250 years in this country.
This was a threat to our democracy in a way that we had not seen. And it manifested itself because of Donald Trump's inability to say. He is still saying he didn't lose the election. I would just ask that. Did he lose the 2020 election?
Tim, I'm focused on the future. Did Kamala Harris censor Americans from speaking their mind in the wake of the 2020 COVID situation?
That is a damning non-answer. What I'm concerned about is, where is the firewall with Donald Trump? Where is the firewall if he knows he could do anything, including taking an election, and his vice president's not going to stand to it? That's what we're asking you, America. Will you stand up? Will you keep your oath of office, even if the president doesn't? And I think Kamala Harris would agree. She wouldn't have picked me if she didn't think I would do that, because of course that's what we would do. So, America, I think you've got a really clear choice on this election of who's going to honor that democracy and who's going to honor Donald Trump.
Donnie, plain and simple. Governor Walz turned to J.D. Vance, said, did he lose the 2020 election, as 63 courts decided, as everyone around Donald Trump knows and has said since that he lost, as Donald Trump has slipped several times and said he lost, couldn't answer the question. So for as smooth as J.D. Vance was, for as fluent as he sounded on policy, we'll get into some of the contradictions on the Affordable Care Act, claiming that Donald Trump tried to save it when in fact the exact opposite is what happened. His own record, misrepresenting his own record, J.D. Vance, on the question of abortion. There's a whole lot to comb through, but he was good last night. That moment that crystallizes the whole thing. You can't even say that your running mate lost the election.
88 minutes. He was good. I mean, he was too slick, maybe, but he certainly was not the kind of despicable character that we've kind of seen in clips of. I thought it was a draw up until that point, and I think that was disqualifying. I think that's disqualifying in the election if you can't say that. I mean, I think that's the issue that whenever I get into debates with anybody, I go, well, look, democracy, kind of on the docket. I want to go back to Kimmel's joke at the beginning that it was boring, and I was thinking the whole time, this is going to be a referendum on what people want going forward. I think the big theme of this thing was that it was very congenial, and it was not a blood sport. It was not UFC. It was more like boxing. And is the American public, your intuition says, well, the American public is ready for that, and they want that. But then I kind of said to myself, there's this sick, twisted thing that people are addicted to the sick entertainment value of Donald Trump, and that they were kind of disappointed. I was enjoying it, but they were disappointed. Oh, no, that's no fun. Are we going to go back to that? Now, my better angels in me say, no, people are ready for that. But it's an interesting question. Final thought, going back to what Joe said, this morning at Mar-a-Lago, what's going on is that people are going up as they're getting their Danish and their bun cake at Mar-a-Lago. They're going up to Donald and saying, boy, Vance was great last night, wasn't he? Wasn't Vance great? And that's going to bother him.
Oh, yeah.
That's going to really bother him, that he was better than Donald Trump, that he could litigate the case better than Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, you're going to see, he's going to be very dismissive of J.D. Vance in the coming weeks. But Donald Trump is not happy this morning because J.D. Vance showed himself to be a superior candidate.
I mean, that's just an objective truth. Put the two side to side. Vance is much, much better at this. And Trump did praise him on social media last night. You did get the sense watching J.D. Vance last night, Jonathan Lemire, that he was aware of his likability being in the dumps of Donald Trump, being this abrasive, caustic figure that people want to look away from, that they're sick of, and to present, in those 90 minutes anyway, a reasonable alternative. Now, you could only think that if you only watched last night and hadn't seen everything else he does on the campaign trail day to day in support of Donald Trump.
Yeah, Vance definitely put forward his best version of himself yesterday, and frankly aided by Governor Walz, who the two men were so civil that Walz almost normalized Vance. He never used the word weird. Tim Walz is on the ticket because he kept talking about how J.D. Vance and Donald Trump and Republicans are weird, and he never used that last night. To Donnie's point about maybe Trump's mixed feelings about the debate, though he praised Vance's appearance, he also at one point mid-debate started tweeting about Pete Rose deserved to be in the Hall of Fame. So perhaps his own attention was sort of lost. But at least I was also struck that the Governor Walz he sort of took a pass on some what could have been some pretty devastating attacks. He didn't mention the weird issue. He never brought up childless cat ladies. Just never came up. He didn't talk about Ukraine. And Ukraine, where Vance has made clear he has no interest in supporting Kyiv. He only brought up Project 2025 once. And that's an issue that's been so effective for Democrats. That said, that final minute in January 6th, about January 6th, was Walz's best moment, and the Harris campaign has already cut an ad.
In a campaign season dominated by divisive rhetoric, last night's VP debate seemed like a throwback. They were polite. The word agree came up 24 times, and they even shared a moment on an issue where they're miles apart on policy, gun violence.
I think all the parents watching tonight, this is your biggest nightmare. Look, I got a 17-year-old, and he witnessed a shooting at a community center playing volleyball. Those things don't leave you.
Tim, first of all, I didn't know that your 17-year-old witnessed a shooting. And I'm sorry about that, and I hope that he's doing okay.
So.
Christ have mercy. It is awful.
Joining us now, Eugene Daniels, Politico White House correspondent, Playbook co-author, and MSNBC political analyst. Jeremy Peters, reporter for the New York Times and an MSNBC contributor. Michael Hardaway is former spokesman for Congressman Hakeem Jeffries. Welcome all. Guys, good to have you on set. Michael, agree was a big word. It was the buzzword last night. But did being civil help either candidate?
Well, this is the way it should be, right?
Really?
We should be in a situation where we can agree respectfully and agreeably. However, I have bad news.
I knew there was a however.
Which is J.D. Vance did an excellent job of being sort of like the Mike Pence nice guy, good guy thing, but he lied most of the night. I mean, the idea that Donald Trump saved Obamacare is egregious. That's just not true. And he had a litany of those things. And so from a substance perspective, we can't lose sight of what was said and whether those things are accurate. But I do want to give J.D. Vance credit and Coach Walz credit for being adults, which is what we need in this era.
Well, Eugene, a panel of swing voters surveyed by the Washington Post gives the win to Vance. So did the New York Times writers, one of whom suggests that Trump will be enraged by Vance's good reviews. Did you hear in Vance's answers, I don't know, a 40-year-old who's trying to preserve a post-election political career? What did you make of last night? Looking ahead.
Yeah. I mean, when you think about the way that he was kind of packaging everything, it was as if you put all of the things that Donald Trump says and believes in, the heart of Trumpism, and put it through kind of a machine that put it out in words that made it not feel, I think, for a lot of Democrats that I talked to, even they would say not as scary for voters, right? I think that was what was really fascinating. And so it was definitely someone kind of putting his stamp on the next iteration, whether it be in 2028 or past that, depending on, or either way, it will be in 2028 for Republicans, kind of figuring out what their party's going to look like, no matter what happens in November. And, there were mistruths the entire time, but repackaging it as a calmer version of Donald Trump, and still being kind of feisty. I do think the headline about Donald Trump not liking that Vance is getting all of this praise is true, which also means people should not put out of the equation that we might get another debate, because I don't know, I still am not convinced, and a lot of reporters aren't, that Donald Trump is going to allow J.D. Vance to have kind of the final say on a big stage for his ticket. And so watching that is something that folks should keep their eye on, especially given how well J.D. Vance did last night.
Okay, so that's a provocative point put out there, Jeremy. Trump had actually made it clear on Truth Social just yesterday he's not debating Kamala Harris again. He pulled out of his 60 Minutes interview. So what's going on, and do you think he could change his mind?
I think he absolutely could. Look, you never know with Trump until the very last minute. And in 2015, remember during the Republican primaries, it was literally the last moment that he pulled out of a debate with the other Republican candidates. So, yeah, I mean, things can change on a dime with him. So I'm not ruling that out at all. What I do think not participating in a debate does is it really complicates a rather effective argument he's had against Kamala Harris, which is, why isn't she doing more interviews? Why isn't she putting herself out there?
Which she's
exactly
doing.
Right. So if his brand, his image that he wants people to see is strength and confidence, it doesn't seem very strong or confident to be pulling out of interviews and hiding from debate moderators when your opponent has agreed to one already.
Yeah, I mean, Trump likes to say I answer questions all the time, but Vaughn was here earlier and pointed out he's only done 2 sit-downs in the last several years. So it's a very different thing. Michael, right after the debate, the Harris campaign put out a new digital ad attacking Vance, but also Donald Trump's age.
He's not just weird or dangerous. He could be a heartbeat away from the Oval Office.
Can he govern from prison?
People should be concerned.
And anonymous.
The former president, he's been off his game.
Anonymous.
He is so disoriented.
Would it take Betsy here?
Do you see Democrats leaning more into the age argument?
Well, they have to. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. Donald Trump spent months attacking President Biden for his age. They're very similar in age. And also, let's just look at Donald Trump over the past few months. His mental acuity seems to be a little off. He can't really finish ideas or thoughts or sentences. Things he says don't really make sense. Windmills causing cancer seems to be a crazy thought, right? And so the idea is that we should figure out whether he's okay. And I think another debate would be perfect for that.
So, Eugene, Trump is getting a lot of attention for some, let's call them hard to follow comments he made while speaking in Milwaukee. Here's a sample.
Global warming wasn't working because the planet's actually gotten a little bit cooler recently. But climate change covers everything. It can rain, it can be dry, it can be hot, it can be cold. Climate change, everything is. Look, and I believe I really am an environmentalist.
You got to see the bathrooms that they project for people. I can't talk to you about it because it's so gross. But basically, water-free bathrooms, water-free, no water. This is not good.
They were like Rambos. It's like putting 1,000,000 Rambos. Good old Sylvester Stallone is my friend. But it's like putting 1,000,000 Rambos. Somebody explained that to me. They're great fighters. It's like putting a Rambo. Give him a knife. And that's all he needs.
So there have been some questions, Eugene, about his cognitive fitness. My question is this actually a notable shift? Or is this just Trump stream of consciousness?
Yeah, I mean, he's always had tangents, right? Like that's something that Donald Trump has always done. He's, when he does
that's
these
part
rallies,
of his brilliance, that he can keep following different tangents.
He did say that, like, there are a lot of things in there at the same time. But I think what you're ending up seeing is, like, when the tangents in 2016 and really even in 2020, there was kind of a coherent strategy to it, right? He was talking about, in 2016, in his words, lying Hillary, or why you shouldn't trust Hillary. And the same thing in 2020 with Biden, why you shouldn't trust Biden, and Biden's going to be bad for the economy, et cetera. And now it's kind of all over the place. Right? There's been a lot made about Hannibal Lecter and him talking about windmills all the time. And I think cognitive side aside, because I'm not a doctor, what you're seeing is happens when someone doesn't really have a policy North Star, right? Like he doesn't really care that much, it seems, about policy across the board. And so when the things that he's really cares about, right, immigration and the economy, things that he knows that voters are really focused on, even those tangents don't seem to make a lot of sense. But it doesn't matter for the people that love him, right? They don't see a change at all. But there's clearly a change in the way that he's speaking. But it's those independents, it is those people in the suburban areas who are looking at this, and they are having concerns. Especially, as Michael said, we spent months, years talking about whether or not President Biden had diminished in the way and because of his age, right? And so when you look at the comparison between the two guys, you look at the age difference, it does make voters and pundits say and question, wait a second, there's clearly something happening here with guys in their late 70s and 80s. And then when you compare him to Vice President Harris, who was so much younger and doesn't have these issues.
First of all, I never supported a national ban. I did when I was running for Senate in 2022 talk about setting some minimum national standard. For example, we have a partial birth abortion ban in place in this country at the federal level. I don't think anybody's trying to get rid of that, or at least I hope not, though I know that Democrats have taken a very radical pro-abortion stance.
I certainly would like abortion to be illegal nationally.
Republican vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance meet Republican Senate candidate J.D. Vance. Joining us now, senior advisor to the Harris-Walz campaign, Ian Sams. He previously served as White House spokesperson for oversight and investigations under the Biden administration. Ian, it's great to have you back on the show. A lot of talk this morning, Monday morning quarterbacking, wondering if Tim Walz took enough of an aggressive stance against J.D. Vance, especially when he lied on stage last night. Your thoughts?
Well, thanks for having me. I think a couple things about this. I was looking last night, middle of the night, about the data that was coming in from the debate. And I know it's another network, but CNN's poll, when they asked people, who's more in touch with people like you, by 13 points, Governor Walz led J.D. Vance. And in that same poll, Governor Walz actually increased his favorability ratings by 4 points more than J.D. Vance did. So I know there's a lot of kind of chatter about the theater criticism of this, but throughout the entire debate, on issue after issue, Governor Walz talked in a really plain-spoken way to the American people about stuff that really matters to them, and J.D. Vance was on defense about Donald Trump's record and failed promises. And so these are the kind of things that I think when real voters are tuned in. We were doing a focus group of undecided battleground state voters and watching their reaction to this. And multiple times you had people laughing at J.D. Vance when the moderators were asking about his past criticisms of Donald Trump, for example. The battleground state voters who were trying to make up their mind in this race were laughing at him. They were really turned off, I think, first and foremost, by that last exchange about January 6th, when Governor Walz asked J.D. Vance squarely to his face, did Donald Trump lose in 2020? And he wouldn't answer. People were really turned off by that, but it was also one of Governor Walz's highest moments in the debate among these key undecided voters. I think that when people see this debate, they saw two different visions for the country. Governor Walz advocating for Kamala Harris's positive vision, and J.D. Vance just defending the sort of chaotic, backward-looking vision of Trump.
Well, and it's interesting. We've been showing you the CNN poll all morning that shows that Tim Walz's favorability really jumped up to a place where you got, politicians these days, national politicians these days, rarely enjoy the numbers that he enjoys right now. It's a 59 favorable to 22 unfavorable split. J.D. Vance improved his image, but he's still upside down. Also, independents in a Politico poll showing that independents overwhelmingly say Walz won the debate. I'm curious, though, about, I'm confused. Maybe you can help me out. Alabama guy. Oh, wait, you're an Alabama. He's an Alabama guy, too. I can make the joke.
Okay.
So I am confused, though. You have Donald Trump, who brags about terminating Roe in one breath, and then the next breath says he's going to be a protector of women's reproductive rights. And then you've got his running mate, J.D. Vance, saying he doesn't support a national abortion ban. And then there's all this audio and all these interviews where he says he does support a national abortion ban. What answer is correct?
Well, in the middle of the debate, Donald Trump went on Truth Social in one of his famous all caps rants and insisted he would never veto a national abortion ban. And I was struck by that, and I think our campaign was struck by that, because when he was debating Vice President Harris on stage in front of 50, 60, 70 million people who were watching, he was asked 3 times, will you veto a national abortion ban? And he didn't answer. So I think that they know that this is a drag on their candidacy, because Donald Trump knows he's responsible for appointing the 3 Supreme Court justices who overturned Roe v. Wade. He knows that he's responsible for the abortion bans that are going into place across this country, where you heard Governor Walz last night speak passionately about the women who are suffering under those bans, tragically women who are losing their lives under these bans. That's the stakes of this election. And I think that when voters are tuned in on this particular issue of reproductive freedom, it's no contest. Vice President Harris is talking about passing a law to restore Roe and signing it. And Donald Trump and J.D. Vance are scrambling to try to make up a position that they have that they think can cobble together enough votes to get through the election. And I think, one thing we also saw last night from Vance, and this issue kind of encapsulates it. He's very proficient at being a chameleon. When you think about the fact that just days ago, he was the one pushing the Springfield lie to demonize communities. And now all of a sudden he's Midwest nice. It's about as fast as when he went from calling Trump Hitler to being Trump's running mate. This is a campaign and a candidacy of Donald Trump and J.D. Vance full of con artists. They're a perfect match on this ticket, and they're trying to sell the country a bill of goods to get themselves through the next 30 days and try to win this election. And what we're going to do is talk about the issues that are actually important to the American people and the plans that the Vice President and Governor Walz have to get them done.
Hi, Ian. It's Jen Psaki. Good to see you. J.D. Vance was on Earth, too. We can just establish that. I don't know what on earth he was talking about for most of that debate, and it was not about his running mate. That being said, so there's a month left till the election. It's very easy for us to all sit around here, even those of us who worked on campaigns, to say Tim Walz should be out there all the time. He should be doing more events. He should be doing more interviews. I believe that's true. I think he's a really effective and powerful and impactful communicator. But now that the debate's behind him, he doesn't have to prep for that. What should we expect? I know he was recently in Michigan. Is he going to be campaigning more? Is he going to be doing more local interviews? What should we anticipate?
Absolutely, he is. In fact, he's going to go on a much more aggressive blitz for Vice President Harris in the coming days. That means hitting the campaign trail really hard. Today, he's going to be in Pennsylvania, in rural Pennsylvania, in central Pennsylvania, in Trump counties that Trump won in 2020. He's going right there, and he's bringing John Fetterman along with him to do small events, gathering with people in the communities across central Pennsylvania. He's going to do more interviews. Vice President Harris is doing more interviews. Vice President Harris sat yesterday for 2 battleground state interviews in Pittsburgh and Atlanta to talk about important issues there, including in Atlanta, the storm and the damage that it's causing, where she's going to be traveling today to survey that damage and get a briefing. So, there are important issues that we're talking about in this race, and they're both going to be out there much more visibly in the next 35 days as they make their closing argument in this race of, do we want to go back to the chaos, the division of Donald Trump, or do we want to take a new way forward for the country, where we actually focus on people's issues and focus on solving them? She gave last week, I think a lot of people, we have very short attention spans in politics these days. But last week, she gave 2 major speeches, one on her economic vision for the country and one on how tough she's going to be on border security after Donald Trump failed to actually take on this issue. She's going to keep talking about those issues over the next 35 days. She's going to talk about what's happening in the Middle East and the crisis that's happening there. And is this a time where you want a Donald Trump back in the White House where he's, using his thumbs to tweet all caps things in the middle of the night and destabilizing the world and the country? Is that what we want? Or do we want someone who's going to approach this with seriousness and actually work to come to a solution for these global challenges? That's the kind of stuff that when they go out there in the coming days, whether it's on TV, whether it's in high impact podcasts, whether it's targeting key voters who are, trying to make up their mind. Maybe they're not even really that tuned in, but they're listening to their favorite sports podcast. And, all of a sudden, Tim Walz or Kamala Harris show up on it, and they have something to say that resonates with them. Those are the kind of things that we're going to be really ramping up over the next month as we close out this campaign.
Senior advisor to the Harris-Walz campaign, Ian Sams, thank you very much for coming on the show this morning.
Roll Tide.
And Roll Tide. Still.
So, Jacob, let's start with you. How are voters there in Michigan reacting to what they saw last night?
Oh, Jose, Anna, they are reacting. I can assure you of that. And there's a reason for that. J.D. Vance will be not far away from where I am today in Oakland County, Michigan. And when you talk to people here at Oakland University, they'll tell you that, it's not 1, 2, or 3 days before one of the 4 candidates for either president or vice president will come through here. Oakland County, it's not an exaggeration to say, will be one of the most consequential counties in this swing state come Election Day. That's because there was a 100,000 vote swing from former President Trump in 2016 to President Biden in 2020. And even next door in Macomb County as well, which leans Republican, the student body populace here at Oakland University is made up of largely young people from both of those key counties in Michigan. And all of these issues that we talk about day in and day out are on the minds of the young people here. By the way, Michigan had some of the largest youth voter turnout in the 2022 midterm elections. Gun violence was one of those issues, particularly because of the shooting at MSU and at a high school nearby here back in 2021. And there was a young woman, Jimena, who was the student body president here at Oakland University, who had brought up that issue in advance of the debate. After the debate, I wanted to ask her and her fellow students about how they reacted to the conversation about gun violence during the debate. Here's what they said. What did you think when you heard J.D. Vance talk about that? Jimena was talking about how because of what happened at one of your neighboring schools here, it's an issue that rings close to home.
I thought it was ridiculous. I mean, the issue is guns. The issue is not better locks on doors.
So, that was a notable and I think memorable exchange from the debate when Senator Vance was talking about the solution to gun violence being better locks on doors and stronger windows. It was something I think that certainly resonated with the voters here. And there were all kinds of issues from reproductive rights to immigration that elicited, I think, a strong response. And it wasn't just in favor of the Harris-Walz campaign, but I think here on this campus, which is, like I said, a largely a Democratic-leaning area, it certainly did resonate with them.
And I guess the big question that is on so many minds as we try to read the tea leaves of where this campaign and this election cycle goes next is, after last night's debate, did it move the needle at all in terms of anyone's vote?
I think so. And you know what, Anna, there's one person I think I should probably ask that. Come on in here, Marcus. Marcus was on with me last night. He has gone somewhat viral this morning. Come over here, Marcus. Marcus, we're live on MSNBC. It's good to see you again on campus. Anna Cabrera was just asking me, do you think that the debate last night moved the needle in any way for your fellow students, or they came out of it, as they went into it with their minds already made up of what they're doing?
I would say people were pretty resolved when they came in and when they left. Nobody really had too many opinion changes. If you saw with the flags how we was doing, nobody really deterred in opinion as much. So people were kind of decided going into the thing and then leaving. I know there was one person who kind of flipped, but I think
that was about it. Marcus, it's good to see you, and now the people of America know who Marcus is, Anna and Jose. He made a big impression last night, guys.
Yeah, we played his clip last hour that has gone viral, the one you mentioned. Please thank him for bringing us his civics lesson that he brought to the country last night. And Jacob, good to see you.
Thank you for your civics lesson.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thanks, Marcus, and thanks, Jacob. And so, Mark, what were your top takeaways from this debate last night?
Well, the main job of any VP candidate is to do no harm. I don't think either one did any harm. But from just a
a performance level, you have to give Vance some credit. He was very polished, very smooth. Walz looked very nervous. He was very jumpy. But the interesting thing is that it seemed more like Vance was just trying to rehabilitate his image as a nice guy. It was a very civil debate. I don't think he did what the real mission that he had to do was to attack Walz and to make clear that his record was much more out of step with the mainstream America, which he didn't do. So I think he helped himself with Trump. I think he helped himself with MAGA. I don't think he moved. I don't think that the debate changed any minds in the country. The VP debates rarely do. The VP candidates rarely do. So I think the race is structurally the same. I think Vance helped himself with the base, but not with undecided voters.
Simone, how do you see Governor Walz's performance? Did he do what he needed to do for Kamala Harris and their campaign?
Look, I think two things can be true at the same time, right? That I personally walked away from last night's debate thinking, okay, the strategy that the campaign had going into the debate about how, if David says something that I want to counter, it's like, now, I agree with some of what David said, but da-da-da-da. Instead of saying, David made some interesting points. You don't always have to disagree. You can disagree and not be disagreeable. And I think that there was a little too much, I agree with what so-and-so said.
You think Governor Walz was doing that too much?
I think there were too many niceties on both sides. I mean, from both of the candidates. I mean, truly, J.D. Vance, he stood up on the debate stage, and it was like he was building a platform and policy in real time. Like, there were just some things that he said when it comes to child care, for example, that is not Donald Trump's plan. Like, he articulated a housing plan that I've never heard from the top of the ticket. And in vice presidential debates, that's not what they're usually there to do. But I will just say this. I do think that Governor Walz, he had some very strong moments. And I think he started off shaky, but got stronger. And like the Tim Walz that people had seen out there during the Veep stakes, he showed up on that debate stage later on. And the clips are how many people are going to experience this debate. They're not going to watch it straight through like many of us did. And I think in the clips that have been shown, the contrast for Governor Walz is great. And so I think that's good. I think that the campaign has taken one of the better exchanges and flipped it into an ad, that January 6th exchange at the end. That is going to be important because there are some voters out there that need to hear more. They need to be reached. And I'm just not talking about independent voters, base Democratic voters, too.
Yeah, I mean, David, let's talk about it. And by the way, I don't recall ever a debate where one of the candidates described himself in moments as a knucklehead, which is an unusual use of terms. But it was so much more civil. Regardless of what the issues were, it seemed as though there was a lot more civility in the discourse. Is this a benefit for one side more than the other?
I don't think so, but that's because, and I think, Mark laid this out and so did Simone, when you have a vice presidential debate, the only thing that matters is, can people live with you being president for a couple of years should a tragedy occur and you have to assume the job? And Walz got batted all around the stage for most of the night, except for some good moments that he had at times later in the debate. But when we look at the snap polls that occurred afterwards, voters actually thought better of him than we did. And there wasn't a moment or an extended period at all where people said, oh, no, this guy can't get anywhere near the Oval Office. That was one of the problems Sarah Palin had in 2008. It wasn't that she was more conservative than John McCain or that she was younger, or that she was a young governor. It's that people looked at her and said, oh, my God, like, you couldn't do the job, not even do it like in a way that I would disagree with. Just, you can't do it. So that's what Tim Walz and J.D. Vance had to accomplish. J.D. Vance accomplished that a lot better than Tim Walz, but I wonder if J.D. Vance did himself a really big favor for 2028, whether or not he runs for the presidency as the sitting vice president or not.
I want to bring in Juanita Tolliver, host of Crooked Media's What a Day podcast and an MSNBC political analyst. Mark Short was chief of staff to Vice President Pence and is a contributor to NBC's Meet the Press. NBC's Vaughn Hilliard is here on set with me. Okay, I know they both think they won, their team did, but what are we hearing from the campaigns about how they think this debate might or won't impact everything going forward?
Right. For the Trump campaign, J.D. Vance executed on exactly what they wanted him to do. And that was, in
Mark knows better than myself here, having worked for the former Vice President Mike Pence, that sometimes explaining away for Donald Trump can be a little difficult. And J.D. Vance, in the words of Donald Trump Jr. after the debate, that he came back with, in his word, were actual facts. Now, a lot of those facts, they were very distorted, but on issues like abortion.
Or just not facts.
Or just not facts. But on issues like abortion, on issues like healthcare policy, he did come out with answers, and he was quick on his feet. There was no flat-footedness from the Ohio senator. And so for the Trump campaign's perspective, look, Donald Trump, he is going to be able to turn out the MAGA faithful. But the question was, are some of those reticent conservatives, those independent voters, J.D. Vance did what he came to do, and that was to make the case that they are a more appealable ticket than perhaps Donald Trump sometimes is able to signal to the American electorate. And J.D. Vance is suggesting he's from the Midwest, he is 40 years old, he is living proof that policies of the Republican Party can move the country forward.
So, Juanita, Governor Walz was in many ways Governor Walz, right? Like, he's a likable guy, and we heard a lot of that afterwards. But he also seemed to leave some real openings on the table. He didn't talk about childless cat ladies. He didn't say weird. No mention of Project 2025. Well, only once. But, J.D. Vance wrote the foreword for that 900-page document. Do you think there were real missed opportunities, or what does Tim Walz's performance last night mean for the whole campaign going forward?
I mean, Chris, for all the things Tim Walz could have said, let's be clear. He hit the nail on the head with that last question directly to J.D. Vance when he asked him, did Donald Trump win the 2020 election? And J.D. Vance did not answer. He obfuscated. He said he's looking forward as though January 6th didn't happen. He said there was a peaceful transfer of power. And that is something that the Harris-Walz campaign has already been running ads on, spliced together with footage of Trump supporters attacking the Capitol on January 6th. So again, there was a buffet before Tim Walz, but I will say he hit J.D. Vance directly where it hurt and hurt hardest, and will benefit the campaign, because that moment, that clip is going to be something that continues to circulate in group chats. It's going to be something that continues to get shared across DMs, across social media, because that is an issue that we know voters are paying attention to across partisan lines. When we talk about protecting democracy and protecting our rights, that is something that independents want to be shored up. And so even as the debate moderators posed the question to J.D. Vance, saying in the past you called for alternate electors, there was no solid response, because J.D. Vance was performing for Donald Trump, whereas Tim Walz was performing and speaking directly to the voters.
And what folks just saw was Vice President Kamala Harris at JBA, Joint Base Andrews. She's on her way to Georgia to survey some of the damage from Helene. Mark, since Juanita brought it up, let me play that moment where Walz did press Vance on January 6th. Here it is.
This is one that we are miles apart on. This was a threat to our democracy in a way that we had not seen. And it manifested itself because of Donald Trump's inability to say. He is still saying he didn't lose the election. I would just ask that. Did he lose the 2020 election?
Tim, I'm focused on the future. Did Kamala Harris censor Americans from speaking their mind in the wake of the 2020 COVID situation?
That is a damning non-answer.
I wonder what, Mark, you make of Vance's response there. And actually, how many undecided voters do you think prioritize what Democrats and, frankly, your old boss have said, that this election is about democracy and preserving democracy?
Well, Chris, I think the reality is it's a tight election. So even if that's not a huge number, it could be a very persuasive constituency in the electorate. So I do think it matters. And I do think, though, as Vaughn said, I think that J.D. Vance was very comfortable. He was able to tackle a lot of issues. He prosecuted a case against the Biden-Harris administration in ways that Trump did not, on the border security issues, on the economy. I thought Vance had an exceptional night. To the last question, look, I've said this before. I feel that J.D. Vance should ask for a refund from Yale Law School if that's what he believes in constitutional law. I think the reality is that he seemed uncomfortable answering that piece of it last night, despite the rest of it being very comfortable. And I think that is an issue that still hangs over the electorate right now.
So answer a question for me, Mark, that I truly don't understand, which is, he knew it was coming. This is not a surprise, right? And we saw in the rest of the debate how prepared he was, but he did not seem prepared for that, or is that what he thought would work?
I don't know, because my sense was he actually intended to say, look, I'm talking about the future, not the past. I know much of the rest of the debate was focused on prosecuting the case of the last 4 years, so that's a little bit in contrast. But I do think it's a different answer than what he said before, which is I would have sent it back. I would have asked the states to do something different, which, of course, no vice president 250 years of our history has ever had the authority to do, nor does a vice president today, and hopefully nor would Kamala Harris when she's going to be in that seat on January 6th in 2025 say, I'm going to selectively choose which states that I do not accept their certification I'm going to send back. So it's not a strong argument, and maybe the best thing to do is to say I'm focused on the future. But again, I thought that Vance had a really, really strong night, aside from that ending of the debate.
Let's talk about how it started, because facts around the world, I think, probably changed what the first question was, and it turned out to be about the Middle East, and they were asked whether they would support a preemptive strike. Here's what happened.
Iran is closer to a nuclear weapon than they were before because of Donald Trump's fickle leadership. And when Iran shot down an American aircraft in international airspace, Donald Trump tweeted, because that's the standard diplomacy of Donald Trump. And when Iranian missiles did fall near U.S. troops and they received traumatic brain injuries, Donald Trump wrote it off as headaches.
I think that's something that Governor Walz just said is quite extraordinary. You yourself just said Iran is as close to a nuclear weapon today as they have ever been. And Governor Walz, you blame Donald Trump. Who has been the vice president for the last 3.5 years? And the answer is your running mate, not mine.
Juanita, did that work? I'm seeing the look on your face. Your face says it all.
Absolutely not. I feel like J.D. Vance might need not only that refund from Yale, but go back to high school basic civics class. Who's in control here? It is not the vice president. I also think that Tim Walz was explicitly smart to hit Donald Trump on something we know the world is watching, his leadership as commander-in-chief and the way he behaved in terms of diplomatic relations globally so poorly, and the way that it reflected back on the United States, because global powers and leaders are watching this election closely, and they don't want to return back to the diplomacy by tweet model. They don't want to return back to Donald Trump embarrassing them or attempting to embarrass them in press conferences, or say the wrong thing about the direction that the United States should be going. So, of course, that answer from J.D. Vance does not work, because we know who's in control. It is President Joe Biden, not Vice President Harris. She does not have those powers.
But let me ask you about another answer, and this one from Tim Walz. When he was pressed on explaining why he said he was in China for the Tiananmen Square protests of 1989, which has been proved not to be true. Here it is.
Look, my community knows who I am. They saw where I was at. Look, I will be the first to tell you, I have poured my heart into my community. I've tried to do the best I can, but I've not been perfect, and I'm a knucklehead at times.
Just to follow up on that, the question was, can you explain the discrepancy?
All I said on this was I got there that summer and misspoke on this, so I will just, that's what I've said.
Was that the kind of answer best answer he could have given?
I feel like he should have started with "I misspoke," and that could have been it. I don't think he needed to go into any type of obfuscation about "my community knows me," but just saying I made a mistake.
Do you think in debate prep, because they knew that was coming,
right?
Do they overthink it?
It sounds like overthinking in this situation with Tim Walz. Like he has been very clear that, sometimes he stumbles over his words. He gets a little bit anxious or uncomfortable in front of the lights in the debate stage. And I feel like this would have been a very simple "I misspoke," and that could have been it. As simple as what we've seen the vice president do in response to questions, especially when it was outlandish things Donald Trump has said about her race and her identity as a Black and South Asian woman. Don't give it oxygen. Just admit the fault and then move on. Should have been the play here for Tim Walz.